Today, we are going to dig into a really brief, kind of bizarre, and honestly confusing story from the book of Genesis. It's just a few verses long, but its shadow, wow, it stretches across centuries. It was used to build a dark and painful justification for racism and slavery.
And just to get a sense of the gravity of what we're talking about, listen to these words from Martin Luther King Jr. He called using scripture to justify segregation a blasphemy. The story we're exploring today is right at the heart of that blasphemy. And understanding how it got so incredibly twisted is, well, it's crucial.
So, this is the core question for us today. How did a short, really ambiguous story about a family dispute after a flood get completely weaponized? How did it become a foundational text for an entire ideology of racial hierarchy? To understand the curse, we first have to talk about the flood that came before it. And, our story doesn't actually start in the pages of the Bible, but deep in the geological past. Okay, so check this out. The Black Sea Deluge Theory. Geologists believed that around 7,500 years ago, the rising Mediterranean Sea just burst through a land barrier at the Bosphorus Strait. Now try to picture a waterfall 200 times the size of Niagara Falls, just pouring into what was then a freshwater lake. The water would have advanced a mile every single day. An event that catastrophic would absolutely burn itself into cultural memory for generations. And what that shows us is that the biblical flood story didn't just appear out of nowhere. It shares some incredible similarities with much older myths, like the Epic of Gilgamesh. You've got the core elements, a divine warning, a hero building a huge boat, saving his family and animals. This was a shared storytelling tradition in the ancient world, and it was likely rooted in the memory of very real, very terrifying floods. So, with that flood context in mind, we can now zero in on the story that happens after the waters recede, and it involves Noah, his sons, and a really shameful incident that's told with, well, puzzling brevity. So, here it is. These few verses from Genesis 9. This is the entire foundation for what became known as the Curse of Ham. Noah plants a vineyard, gets drunk, passes out naked in his tent. His son Ham sees him, tells his brothers, who then respectfully cover their father up without looking. When Noah wakes up, he curses Ham's son, Canaan. And that's it. I'm not kidding, that is the whole story. Now, the first thing you probably notice is it's incredibly vague. The text just says Ham saw the nakedness of his father. What does that even mean? Was just looking at him really a crime so terrible that it deserved a multi-generational curse? This ambiguity, right here, is the first major puzzle. For over 2,000 years, scholars have been trying to fill in that blank. And the theories range from simple disrespect and gossip all the way to something way more sinister. Some ancient commentators even suggested it was a euphemism for castration or incest. The point is, the text is so vague, nobody knows for sure. And that leads us to the second massive puzzle. Let's just say Ham did commit some terrible act. Why is his son, Canaan, the one who gets cursed? Ham seems to walk away completely fine, but his son is condemned to be a servant of servants. Why? So why curse Canaan? Well, one theological theory is that since God had just blessed Ham, maybe Noah couldn't directly curse him. But the most likely answer, at least according to modern scholars, is political. The story was probably a foundation myth, created to give the ancient Israelites a kind of divine justification for conquering the people who lived in the land of Canaan. So, here it is, the most crucial point of all. After all that debate about the crime and the punishment, notice what is completely, totally, 100% absent from this original story. Any mention of race, any mention of skin color. It's just not there. So if the story isn't about race, how on earth did it become one? Well, to answer that, we have to look at the very next chapter in Genesis, which has this fascinating document known as the Table of Nations. Think of this chapter as the ancient Israelites' map of the known world, but it's structured like a family tree. Each of Noah's sons becomes the ancestor of a whole region. So Japheth's descendants, they head north and west to Europe. Shem's descendants, the Semites, they're in the Middle East. And this is the crucial part. Ham's descendants, like Cush, which is Ethiopia, and Mizraim, which is Egypt, they're the peoples of Africa. And that created a direct, though not yet racial, link between Ham and the African continent. And this is where the story begins its long, dark transformation. You have the vague curse on one hand and this geographic family tree on the other. They became two pieces of a puzzle that later interpreters would assemble into a full-blown ideology of racial hierarchy, twisting the original myth for their own power. This curse became this sort of multi-purpose tool, adapted over and over again through the centuries. In the ancient world, it was about that land dispute with the Canaanites. By medieval Europe, it was being used to justify serfdom. But with the rise of the transatlantic slave trade, boom, the interpretation becomes explicitly racial. And by the 19th century in America, it was one of the primary biblical arguments used to defend slavery as a divinely ordained institution.
And a little linguistic trick helped this racist interpretation really take root. You see, while the Bible never says Ham was black, his name became associated with blackness. This happened through a kind of folk etymology. People linked his name to a Hebrew word that sounded similar and meant dark or hot, even though the two words were completely unrelated. But that false connection helps cement the idea in people's minds.
Okay, so let's just put it all together. Let's look at this side by side. The original text says Canaan was cursed. The interpretation twisted that to mean all of Ham's descendants. The text says the curse was servitude. The interpretation added perpetual slavery and black skin as its mark. And where the original text said absolutely nothing about race, the twisted interpretation made race its absolute central feature. I mean, the gap between the story and the ideology is just massive. So after tracing this really long and disturbing history, what are the key things we should really take away from all this? Why does understanding this misuse of a story still matter so much today? Well, today, the overwhelming consensus among religious scholars is that this racist interpretation is a complete and total distortion. The arguments against it are really clear. The curse came from a drunken Noah, not from God. Ham himself wasn't even cursed, only his son Canaan. And most importantly, the original text is completely silent on race. The entire racial element was invented centuries later.
Ultimately, the story of the so-called Curse of Ham is a chilling and powerful case study. It shows us how a story, especially an ancient and ambiguous one, can be completely ripped from its context and weaponized. It shows how an ideology can be projected backwards onto a text to make it say whatever powerful people need it to say to justify their actions.
And this really leaves us with a final, crucial question. This one short, strange story shows how easily our narratives can be twisted to serve agendas their original authors never could have imagined. And it's a reminder to think critically about the stories we're told and to ask ourselves, what stories are we still getting wrong today?